Today we're going to be talking about The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. This is his fourth novel, and I have done a video on this one in the past, but I've recently reread the book, and so I wanted to go over my thoughts, because I think they've changed a little bit since the last time that I read it, and I also wanted to include it as part of this new series of Dickens's novels. It's a very interesting book because at its time The Old Curiosity Shop was such a sensation of a novel, but in modern times, it's not looked upon as one of Dickens' best works, and actually has one of the examples of his worst writing, at least according to some. So it's going to be interesting to unpack this one. My personal view is that I think it is one of his better, if not his best, early novel, but it does still have some flaws as well. Part 1, Summary. The Old Curiosity Shop contains several interweaving stories, but the primary story is that of Nell Trent and her grandfather. Her grandfather owns the Old Curiosity Shop, an old antique shop, at the start of the novel, but due to his gambling debts, he quickly loses the novel, and he and Nell are forced out of the shop and have to live life as beggars. The Old Curiosity Shop follows them on their travels, going through the highs and the lows of struggling to survive. Part 2, A Rocky Start. The Old Curiosity Shop gets off on the wrong foot because it's told in a very bizarre way. Initially we get a narrative in first person told from a character who is he bumps into little Nell one night and goes back to the Old Curiosity Shop with her. And for a while we get his perspective on Nell, who is being left at home by her grandfather mysteriously in the night, and he soon learns that the grandfather is up to no good, that he's a gambler. But after about 3 chapters, this framing device vanishes, and we then go into a third-person narrator for the rest of the story. Now this is very jarring, although there was a good reason for it, I suppose, at the time. So Dickens actually had the Old Curiosity Shop as part of another series that he was writing called Master Humphrey's Clock, and this was meant to be one story within that framing device. But then he realised that the Old Curiosity Shop was basically its own thing, and it would not really work in this format, so he decided to ditch that kind of narrative and switch. And this is something that's actually quite common with Dickens' novels. Because he was serialising them, it meant that he would chop and change things, and he wouldn't necessarily have a fully fleshed out plan throughout the whole course of his stories. Sometimes that makes for some very surprising and fun twists and turns. In this case though, it is a bit jarring to read, to have it set up in this way, and then for it just to completely break off afterwards. Still, I do think that there is some good tension in the early part of the book, trying to understand what's going on with Nell and her grandfather and their family drama. All of that stuff is still really good. There's also a very good scene where Nell is left at home alone by her grandfather, and the narrator wonders what it must be like for her to be in bed in this creepy old antique shop surrounded by all these ancient objects. And actually this mirrors very nicely what happens towards the end of the novel when Nell is dying, again in this ancient church, and her body again is surrounded by all these ancient scary things. So I like that there's this mirroring with Nell in terms of where she begins the novel and where she ends the novel. So even here there are some really interesting things going on. Overall though, I do think that it is a bit of a rocky start to the novel, but once we get out of it, once we have the narrative switch, once we have Nell and her grandfather going out from the shop, things pick up a lot more. Part 3, A Dark Oliver Twist. So I see the Old Curiosity Shop in some ways as responding to some of the themes of Oliver Twist. Again, we have the powerlessness of children, but from a different perspective this time. With Oliver Twist, the damage caused to Oliver is typically by society. It's the workhouse system that he finds himself in that ultimately pushes him down to ending up with Fagin. And it's all about the kind of more broader social stuff. And there certainly is that stuff too in the Old Curiosity Shop, but here the focus is much more on family and how people's families can actually be a destructive force. Ultimately, the cause of Nell's downfall is not society per se, but rather her grandfather and his gambling debts, his obsession with trying to make money in this way, and ultimately it going terribly for him and for her. I like the way that Dickens describes the grandfather. On the one hand, he's this soft-spoken, gentle old man who loves his granddaughter, but then because of his gambling and his obsession, he's also incredibly cruel in some cases, and twisted and dark and monstrous. And this comes out in a scene when he is with Nell and he's starting to gamble again, and she's trying to discourage this, and he says not very nice things to her and treats her in a very cold, monstrous way. And he even looks like a monster to Nell. And so Dickens' way of showing how this unassuming, gentle man has this dark, evil side that comes out because of his obsession is really well done. Of course, Nells Death is also one big difference with Oliver Twist, and why again I think it's darker, because we don't have that happy ending. This actually wasn't Dickens' idea, it was his friend John Forster's idea to kill Nell, but I do think it was a good idea just in thinking about the kind of whole catalogue of Dickens novels, because otherwise we're just having lots of happy endings for the orphans, and maybe it was a good idea to just have a different story where things don't always turn out for the best, despite the goodness of the character. And the last comparison I want to make between Nell and Oliver, which maybe is somewhat unpopular, but although Nell does have a reputation for being very insipid and weak, I think that is because people just remember her for her death scene. But actually, if you think about the whole character, I don't see her as being very insipid at all. In fact, she is mostly the instigator of most of the action in the story. Her grandfather is the insipid one. Aside from when he's gambling, he's pretty much just a blank sheet. He does nothing. And it's Nell who is constantly pushing them on. It's Nell, when he gets into gambling, that decides that they have to get out and get away before they get into trouble. She actually is quite active in the story, and I find her way more interesting in that regard than Oliver, who, except for his one scene early on in the book where he stands up for his mother, is pretty much just passed around from pillar to post. So on the whole, I do find Nell a more engaging kind of archetype for Dickens here. Yes, she's still that virtuous, too good for this world type, but there's just a little bit more to her that I think maybe people miss because we often think about where she ends up. Part 4. 3 storylines. I would say that there are 3 protagonists really in the Old Curiosity Shop, and they each have an intersecting storyline. Obviously there's little Nell and her adventure with her grandfather. They become beggars, then they have to find their way in the world and make a living. Then there's Kit, who is a young boy who worked for Nell and her grandfather. He gets sacked at the beginning of the novel, and we follow him as he tries to make his own way in the world as well. A bit like Nicholas Nickleby in that regard, but more comic and light than Nicholas Nickleby. And his story ends up climaxing when Daniel Quilp, the evil villain of the piece, he decides to frame Kit for a crime that he didn't commit, and then we get this dramatic court case, and will Kit go down and all that kind of stuff. One of the best parts of the book, in my opinion. And then we also have a third storyline with a character called Richard Swiveller, who unfortunately is called Dick Swiveller throughout the story, and he is the friend of Nell's brother, Frederick. Now, Frederick believes that the grandfather has some secret money stashed away, and when the grandfather and Nell run away, he wants to pursue them to get hold of that money. And he persuades his friend Dick to marry Nell so that he can get hold of the money as well. And this storyline kind of goes out of the window. Frederick just vanishes as a character, which we will come to later. But Dick, initially he comes across as a comic, secondary villain, but actually ends up becoming a good-hearted hero in the story. And his storyline, I think, is actually the most entertaining, just because his character is very entertaining, and it's just a twist that you don't expect. And uniting all of these 3 storylines, we have probably one of Dickens' best comic, silly, over-the-top theatrical villains, and that is Daniel Quilp, a hunchbacked, crooked dwarf who just loves to cause mischief and terror, just for the sake of it. He just doesn't care. He's unapologetically evil, and he's perfectly happy with that. And he's a very entertaining villain, and he's constantly following these characters around, and he's pretty much the instigator for all of the suffering. It's him that the grandfather loses all of his money to. It's him that pushes Frederick and Swiveller to do this plot to marry Nell, although Daniel knows, of course, that they don't have any money, so he's just doing it because he wants them to suffer. And it's also Daniel that frames Kit for the crime, as I already said. He's a great villain. He is a bit over the top, and he's not very, three-dimensional, but that can be entertaining sometimes in a novel. He reminds me a lot of Richard III in that regard, just one of these unabashedly wicked villains that, if you were putting on a production of this, you'd love to play that character. Of all 3 storylines, I think that they blend quite well together with each other, and I actually think they all have their moments. Little Nell and her grandfather remind me a lot of the Pickwick Papers because it's more episodic. They have these people who they meet, they have a few chapters with them, and they go off to the next thing. But of course it's much darker than the Pickwick Papers because most of their meetings with people, generally speaking, are quite dark. There's always a threat, are these people going to expose them? Are these people going to harm them? There are some light moments in their journey, but it is mostly a dark journey. So it's similar to the Pickwick Papers, but much more miserable. My favourite part of their travels together, though, is when they meet Mrs. Jarley, who runs a travelling waxworks museum, and she's a fantastic character. She doesn't play much of a big role in the story, but she's just very gregarious, and she kind of intimated that she's a bit of an alcoholic, but a harmless one, and she helps Nell, and you get a feel that maybe things are going to work out with her, but unfortunately, thanks to the grandfather, they don't. But that's a really good part of the novel. I really like her as a character, and that whole episode as well. There are parts of Nell's story, though, that are uneven. I think that when they get to the village at the end, after they've gone through their arduous journey, Dickens spends a little bit too long in this sort of holding pattern where he's sort of, planting the seeds for Nell's death, because we can see that maybe she's getting ill. And it just becomes a little bit too pastoral, a little bit too saccharine, already building up towards that very saccharine ending for Nell. But I think that is a weak bit of the story, because it just puts things to a standstill, especially when we have all the other stuff going on, which is a lot more dramatic. Swiveler's story, as I said, is probably my favourite. I like that he begins the story just coming across as this lackey that's just kind of stupid and does, you don't think he's going to do much aside from just be the idiot sidekick of a secondary villain, but actually he becomes a very good character who actually resolves a lot of the major plot in the story as well. His story really starts to change when he gets a job with the lawyer, Mr. Brass, and his sister, Sally Brass, who are also two very good side villains as well, and they have a servant girl working for them that Swiveller calls the Marchioness, and she's a great character. She doesn't spend much time in the story, but she's a very shrewd character, although on the surface she comes across as being a victim, and she has a very good relationship with Dick Swiveller, and they kind of come together and really bring out the best in each other. And lastly, we have Kit, who I would say is probably the person that I like the least. Not because I think he's a bad character, I don't think he is, but his storyline is for the most part just him making his way in the world, and that's fine, but it only really gets going when he gets framed for the crime, and that's really when you start to care for that storyline, or at least that's when I cared about it. Because when it comes to Nell, there's the stakes because she is in danger going through the travels, and when it comes to Richard Swiveller, we get his whole comic stuff, we get the Brasses and their great characters. With Kit, things are just a little bit more mundane as far as I'm concerned, until we get towards the end of the story. So all three storylines I think work really well for the most part, and they integrate quite well too. And you can really feel with the Old Curiosity Shop that Dickens is on a roll when it comes to his development. He's really got down that pastoral stuff. He can do comedy, but also have these darker moments as well. He's got great characters, he's getting better at developing them. And even with the more episodic narratives, there's more of a through line. Even with Nell and her grandfather, yes, there are episodes, but it's underlined with this theme of them running away and being beggars and having to make their way in the world. So I think that Dickens is really tying all of the stuff that he was doing in the previous novels together to make a pretty good novel here. Part 5, Little Nell, Sentimentality and Author's Grief. So I want to begin by pointing out again that when it came to the decision to kill Nell, it wasn't Dickens' own idea to do this, but his friend John Forster. And I think that knowing this, which I didn't know the previous time that I read this, has actually changed my view on Nell's death a little bit, and given me a new kind of appreciation for it. So Nell's death scene is, typically taken to be the paradigm example of Dickens' flaw as a writer. This overwhelming, saccharine sentimentality that is just too ridiculous. And most of this just comes from Oscar Wilde and that famous quote of his. And I do think that to some extent it's become a bit of a cliche criticism, in the sense that a lot of people will say this of Dickens who know the Oscar Wilde quote but haven't actually read the passage that he's talking about. And I think it's good to always go back and reassess these things, and to maybe think about whether or not it is actually the case that these things are true, rather than just accepting them. And in terms of my own view, I do find that the Nell's death is overdone. I do think it is overwritten and sentimental, but I do think that Wilde is overstating his point as well, which, it's Wilde, so of course he is. And the reason why I think this is because when I found out that it wasn't Dickens' idea to kill Nell, and when I also found out that in reading Dickens' biography, he was very attached to Nell and his characters in general, to the point of obsession. There are letters from Dickens where he talks about character deaths as if he's actually killing people. And, that does sound dramatic and far-fetched. I mean, of course it is. These characters aren't real, but it does show you how Dickens relates to the characters in his stories and to the world that he creates. And I think that seeing this for Nell's death, he maybe is guilty about the fact that he's killing her, because it wasn't his idea. He's very attached to these characters. And so we get this very overwritten saccharine death scene because he's incredibly guilty about having to do it. So he wants to make it as painless and angelic as possible. He's deifying Nell, more or less, because he feels so guilty about having to kill her. And I think seen in this way, that's a very interesting way to look at the story, because it shows you something about the creative process and how authors sometimes relate to their characters. And it makes you think about how difficult it can be for an author to actually kill off a character, especially a character that they're really, really attached to. That being said, I do still think it is a flaw in the writing, because after all, it is an example of the novelist coming into the story too much. And as a novelist, you always want to try and keep yourself out of your story as much as you can, unless you're literally in the story as a character. It's kind of like, it's not quite moralizing here, because Dickens isn't really making a moral point with Nell's death per se, but it's a similar sort of flaw where, you know, when you moralize, the issue with it, it's not that your novel has a moral message, it's that the moral message is coming from this external voice. It's coming from outside the story, and as a reader you feel like you're being told what to think, rather than, you know, being moved to think that way by the actual internal aspects of the story. And I think it's a similar thing here. It's that Dickens can't actually come to terms with what he's doing to Nell, so he overwrites and overcompensates, and so then we get this overly saccharine ending to the story. So do I think it's a problem? Yes. But do I think it's very interesting? Definitely. And I also do think, maybe it's just me, I think I can be a bit sentimental sometimes, but I do think that there is some beautiful poetry in some parts of Nell's death. And certainly the build-up to that moment as well is done very well, because it's not obvious that Nell is going to die until you see that she's dead. And Dickens really does play with his audience's heartstrings. You can tell why it was a bit of a sensation at the time. Part 6. Missed opportunities and loose ends. So I've pretty much been mostly positive of the Old Curiosity Shop, but there are some little niggles and things that bug me about it. And I think there are certain characters that I just think could have got a bit more time, and I think that there are certain plot elements that were just dropped in ways that I didn't find very satisfying. I've already talked about the framing device, so I won't talk about that anymore, but one thing that also bugs me is the character of Frederick, Nell's brother. So at the beginning of the novel, we get introduced to Frederick. He comes round to the shop, and him and the grandfather have this big row, and it kind of sets up this antagonism between the two characters. And then we have Frederick and Dick planning to have Nell married to Dick so they can get the money. And once that plan is made, Dick, through the help of Quilp, gets this job with the Brass family, and we pretty much just focus on Dick from that point on. And Frederick, I think after that point actually, never returns to the story, except for a passing mention at the end of the story when we just find out, you know, what became of him. And this to me just seems bizarre, that Dickens just completely wrote out this character. And perhaps it was because he planned something for Frederick and just lost interest. Perhaps it was because he just saw the potential of Dick and thought, you know what, actually, this is the character that we should be focusing on, and so just, you know, screw Frederick. But it just jars as a narrative, because you have this setup early on that puts Frederick in this particular role, and then it just gets dropped later. So that was something that bugs me a little bit. Another thing that I think is a bit weak is the character of the Marchioness, because although she is a great character, she's very entertaining, there's just not enough time with the character. So we first meet her, I think, when Sally is being incredibly cruel to her, bullying her, beating her up, I think. And the Marchioness at that point just comes across as being another victim child. And that's all she appears to be. It's also implied that she may be the daughter of Daniel Quilp and Sally Brass as well, which is an interesting side bit. But that's how she comes across. Then when Dick meets her properly, we actually learn that she's not so innocent. She certainly, you know, she doesn't deserve the abuse that she gets, but she listens in, she hears conversations, she even steals things from time to time, and she's certainly willing to, you know, to do what she can to get away from the Brass family and to ultimately help Dick Swiveller as well later on. And so you have this just new side to her personality that comes out. And it's great to watch that side of her personality, especially when she's interacting with Dick, when he's teaching her how to play cards and all that. But it just feels like a missed opportunity. And in the biography that I was reading by Claire Tomalin, she points out or suggests that the reason why the character is downplayed is perhaps because she's a kind of competition for Nell, in the sense that they're both young women that suffer, but the Marchioness arguably, and I think she's right to say this, is the more interesting one. And so maybe to put her too much in the frame might have detracted from Nell somewhat, and so he just decided not to go there. But I do think that's a shame, because I do think the Marchioness is a great character. The final thing that I don't particularly like about the novel, or I'm undecided about really, because I think taken in isolation, I actually think it's quite good. So it's Daniel Quilp's death in the story. It's kind of like Bill Sikes' death in that we get a chase scene and the person just dies by accident. And it's not as bad as the Sikes one, because the Sikes one to me is just not very believable. Whereas the Quilp one, he's staying in this sort of part of town by the docks where it's all slippy and dark, and if you're not careful, you might fall in and drown. And Dickens actually does a good job of foreshadowing that earlier in the novel. I think it's Dick Swiveller or Mr. Brass goes to see Daniel, and Daniel's had enough of him and tells him to leave. It's very dark, and Brass is terrified of going out in the darkness, and Quilp is just like, yeah, I don't care, go drown for all I care. And so there is a certain kind of poetic justice in the death, but it's just that, like with Sikes' death, because it's an accident, it just doesn't have the same satisfaction that a proper death, or even just arrest, would have had. So that is something that bugs me a little bit about Quilp's resolution in the story, but it does have its moments. It's quite a gruesome scene. Dickens is very good at scary death scenes, so that works really well. But yeah, as a resolution to the character, I'm not convinced by it. Part 7, conclusion. Overall, I think that The Old Curiosity Shop is a fantastic book. It does have its weaknesses, but in terms of Dickens' earlier novels and reading them, in succession in this way, I do feel like it is the culmination of everything that's gone before. It's got the pastoral stuff of the Pickwick Papers, it's got the child stuff of Oliver Twist, it's got an overarching narrative, you have the Kit storyline where it's someone trying to come up in the world, like Nicholas Nickleby. All that stuff is being brought together here in a way that I just think more or less works. There are some loose ends, there are some things that don't quite fit with the framing narrative and with Frederick and with the Marchioness, but on the whole, I think it works really well and I enjoyed it. The ending is a little bit sentimental and overdone, but it does say something interesting about Dickens and how he relates to his characters. And overall, I would say that I liked it much more on this read than when I first read it, although I didn't hate it on the first time around either. Alright, that's it for this review. Let me know down in the comments if you've read The Old Curiosity Shop. What do you think of the book? How do you think it compares to Dickens' other earlier novels? Do you think that the others are better? Do you think that this one is the best one, like I do? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to discussing things with you. That's it for this video though. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!